The chainsaw's sudden roar sliced through Margaret Holloway's morning tranquility like a razor-sharp blade through thin silk. She was mid-sip of her organic fair trade coffee when she saw Diane Brennan, the neighborhood's most notorious HOA board member, standing in her front yard surrounded by three burly landscapers wearing matching green shirts. Diane was cutting down her grandmother's 100-year-old oak tree. Margaret's hand trembled, coffee splashing onto her pristine white silk blouse. She watched in horror as branch after branch crashed onto her carefully manicured lawn, wood chips exploding like shrapnel. The tree, a living memorial to her grandmother Elizabeth, who had planted it the day she bought the house in 1923, was being dismantled without a single warning. "What the hell are you doing?" Margaret burst through her front door, her voice a controlled hurricane of rage. Diane didn't even look up. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and pulled out a clipboard, her perfectly pressed khaki pants not showing a single wrinkle. Violation of Section 4.3, subsection C of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association bylaws, she announced with bureaucratic precision. Overgrown trees posing potential structural risks are subject to immediate removal. Margaret knew Diane. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Diane. She was the kind of HOA board member who measured grass height with a ruler and sent violation notices if your garbage can was 2 inches outside the designated area. But this was a new level of administrative tyranny. "This tree has been here longer than you've been alive," Margaret said, her voice low and dangerous. "It's a historical landmark. It's on the city's heritage registry." Diane merely smiled, a thin, razor-sharp curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Paperwork has been filed." The board voted unanimously. "Your appeals window closed last Tuesday." The landscapers continued their methodical destruction, the chainsaw's mechanical growl punctuating each fallen branch. Margaret noticed the precise military-like efficiency of their movements. These weren't just workers, they were execution specialists in the world of suburban landscaping warfare. Her mind raced. She was a corporate lawyer specializing in environmental litigation. Diane had just made a catastrophic mistake, and Margaret was going to make her pay, not just financially, but in a way that would become neighborhood legend. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Every cut, every fallen branch would be documented. Diane thought she was following rules, but Margaret knew something she didn't. Sometimes the rules have more layers than anyone expects. The last massive branch crashed down, sending a plume of dust and leaves into the air. The magnificent oak, a silent witness to generations of Holloway family history, was now nothing more than a stump and scattered lumber. Diane turned, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Any questions?" Margaret's smile was cold enough to freeze nitrogen. "Oh, Diane," she said softly, "we're just getting started." 3 days after the tree massacre, Margaret's research had transformed her living room into a war room. Architectural drawings, historical documents, and HOA bylaws covered every surface. Her laptop screen flickered with email chains, property records, and a growing digital arsenal of evidence. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association wasn't just an organization. It was Diane Brennan's personal fiefdom. Margaret had discovered a web of connections that would make most corporate conspiracy theorists look like amateurs. Diane's husband owned the landscaping company that had destroyed her tree. Her brother-in-law sat on the city's historic preservation board. Her nephew worked in the municipal planning office. This wasn't just about a tree. This was systemic corruption. Margaret's phone buzzed. It was her best friend and fellow lawyer, Alina Rodriguez. "Tell me you're not doing anything stupid." Alina's voice crackled with familiar concern. "I'm doing something precisely calculated," Margaret replied, spreading out a series of property surveys. Diane made 3 critical mistakes. First, she didn't properly notify me of the tree removal. Second, the tree was officially registered as a heritage landmark. Third, her landscaping company didn't follow proper environmental impact protocols. Alina knew that tone. It was the same voice Margaret used when dismantling multinational corporations in court. "How much are we talking?" Margaret's fingers flew across her keyboard, calculating damages, conservative estimate, $12,000 in landscaping restoration, historic tree replacement, and environmental remediation fees. The doorbell rang. Margaret's Ring camera showed a courier with a certified letter. She signed, knowing exactly what was coming. Official HOA violation notice. Diane had the audacity to send her a fine for unauthorized landscape obstruction. A fabricated violation citing that Margaret's now-destroyed tree had somehow been blocking neighborhood sightlines. She chuckled. Diane had just handed her the perfect legal ammunition. Margaret began drafting her response, not an email, not a phone call, a meticulously crafted legal document that would make law school professors weep with joy. Each paragraph was a surgical strike, each footnote a precision-guided missile of legal logic. She wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to systematically deconstruct Diane's entire network of suburban power. The printer hummed, producing multiple copies. Certified mail envelopes waited, stamped and ready. Margaret looked at the framed photo of her grandmother, the woman who had planted that tree almost a century ago. "Watch this," she whispered to the photograph. Outside, a mockingbird landed on the tree stump, its song a defiant note against the morning's manufactured silence. Margaret smiled. Some battles are won before they even begin. The Oak Ridge Estates monthly HOA meeting transformed the community center's beige conference room into a battlefield of passive-aggressive suburban warfare. Fluorescent lights glinted off polished name tags, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air like a warning. Diane Brennan sat at the head of the table, her power pose radiating calculated confidence. She wore a crisp navy blazer that screamed, "Manager who means business." Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair swept into a no-nonsense bob. Surrounding her were 6 other board members, each looking slightly terrified and deeply impressed by her earlier tree removal triumph. Margaret arrived precisely 17 minutes late, a strategic move designed to draw maximum attention. The room fell silent as she walked in, her tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the typical khaki and pastel palette of suburban HOA fashion. She carried a thick binder that looked like it could stop a small-caliber bullet, its edges reinforced and tabs meticulously labeled. "Ms. Holloway," Diane began, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness, "we were just discussing the recent landscape maintenance in the neighborhood." Margaret smiled. It was the kind of smile that made opposing counsel in courtrooms start sweating. "Indeed," she responded, placing her binder on the table with a deliberate thud that echoed through the room. "I'd like to discuss the unauthorized removal of a heritage registered oak tree from my property." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Margaret knew her audience. These were people who feared conflict more than they loved rules, a perfect demographic for her carefully constructed legal assault. She began presenting her evidence: property surveys dating back to 1923, detailed photographs of the tree, certification from the city's Historical Preservation Committee. Each document was a precision-guided missile of bureaucratic destruction. The tree in question, Margaret explained, her voice calm and clinical, was not just a landscape feature. It was a documented historical landmark, protected under 3 separate municipal ordinances. Diane's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. This wasn't going according to her script. Margaret pulled out her next weapon, a comprehensive landscaping estimate detailing the full restoration costs. $12,000, broken down into meticulous line items: expert assessment, replacement of soil, specialized replanting of a heritage-class oak, environmental impact mitigation. Furthermore, Margaret continued, "I've filed a formal complaint with the Municipal Environmental Board and initiated legal proceedings against both the HOA and the landscaping company." The room went so quiet you could hear a HOA newsletter drop. Diane's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her fingers, adorned with an expensive French manicure, gripped her Mont Blanc pen so tightly it seemed ready to snap. This was more than a dispute over a tree. This was a declaration of war. And Margaret Holloway had just fired the first perfectly aimed shot. The aftermath of the HOA meeting spread through Oak Ridge Estates like wildfire, burning through neighborly gossip networks faster than a summer brush fire. Diane Brennan's reputation was no longer the immaculate shield it had been just weeks earlier. Whispers followed her like a trailing shadow at the local Starbucks during morning dog walks and hushed conversations behind perfectly trimmed hedges. Margaret's lawsuit wasn't just a legal document. It was a nuclear option in the world of suburban governance. Alina Rodriguez arrived at Margaret's house with a bottle of vintage Cabernet and a conspiratorial grin. "You're enjoying this way too much," she said, pouring 2 glasses of deep red wine. "Enjoyment is a strong word," Margaret replied, spreading out the latest batch of documents on her dining room table. "This is professional satisfaction." But Diane wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, Margaret received a counterfiling that made her laugh out loud. Diane was claiming that the heritage oak tree was actually a safety hazard that threatened neighborhood property values. The documentation was laughably thin. A single report from a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. Amateur move. Margaret's network ran deep. Within hours, she had counter-evidence from 3 independent arborists, city historical preservation experts, and environmental scientists. Each document was a nail in Diane's increasingly fragile coffin of credibility. The local news caught wind of the story. A small piece in the community section quickly became a front-page feature. "Neighborhood dispute reveals potential HOA corruption," the headline screamed. Diane's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Her husband's landscaping company started losing contracts. Her brother-in-law faced questions from municipal authorities. Her nephew's position in the planning office suddenly looked precarious. But Margaret knew the real battle was just beginning. The municipal hearing was scheduled, and Margaret prepared with the precision of a military strategist. Every document was color-coded. Every witness statement was rehearsed. Every potential counterargument was dissected and neutralized. Elena watched her friend with a mixture of admiration and mild terror. You realize this is about more than a tree now, right? Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. It was never just about a tree. The night before the hearing, a manila envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a series of documents that made Margaret's breath catch. Financial records, communication logs, evidence of systematic HOA board manipulation that went far beyond Oak Ridge Estates. Diane had no idea what was coming. The game had just changed, and Margaret Holloway was about to checkmate an entire system of suburban bureaucratic corruption. Outside, where the old oak tree once stood, a small sapling had begun to sprout, a silent testament to resilience, to hope, to the promise of something new growing from the destruction of the old. The municipal hearing room felt like a gladiatorial arena disguised as a bureaucratic chamber. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across rows of wooden chairs, catching the nervous perspiration of Oak Ridge Estates residents who had come to watch the showdown. Margaret sat at the front table, her legal documents arranged with surgical precision. Diane occupied the opposing side, her earlier confidence now replaced by a brittle veneer of composure. The manila envelope Margaret had received, its contents, a nuclear auction of suburban detective work, remained carefully tucked in her briefcase. Administrative law judge Helen Chen adjusted her glasses, her expression a masterclass in judicial neutrality. Ms. Holloway, Judge Chen began, you're alleging multiple violations in the removal of a heritage tree. Ms. Brennan's HOA board claims the removal was necessary for neighborhood safety. Explain your position. Margaret stood, her movements deliberate. Your Honor, this isn't about a single tree. This is about a systematic pattern of abuse of power within the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She began presenting evidence, the original tree's historical significance, improper notification procedures, financial connections between board members and the landscaping company. Each document was a precisely aimed dart, puncturing Diane's defensive strategy. The unexpected twist came from an unlikely source. Thomas Reynolds, a retired civil engineer who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 37 years, raised his hand. I'd like to provide his statement, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of neighborhood history. Judge Chen nodded. Thomas detailed a pattern of HOA board misconduct stretching back years, selective enforcement of rules, backroom deals, contracts awarded to friends and family. His testimony transformed the hearing from a tree dispute into an expose of neighborhood governance. Diane's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confident to confused to terrified. The manila envelope's contents suddenly seemed almost unnecessary. Margaret had won before she even played her final card. During a brief recess, Elena leaned close. You're enjoying this way too much, she whispered. Margaret's response was a smile that could freeze fire. The hearing reconvened. Judge Chen's questions became increasingly pointed, directed not just at the tree removal, but at the broader patterns of HOA board behavior. Diane's responses grew more fragmented, more defensive. Then Margaret introduced the contents of the mysterious manila envelope. Bank records, email chains, communication logs that revealed a web of financial impropriety far more serious than a single tree removal. These weren't just violations of HOA bylaws. These were potential criminal matters. The room held its collective breath. Thomas Reynolds watched from the back of the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it needs someone willing to fight back. Outside the hearing room, a gentle breeze rustled through the municipal building's landscaping. A single acorn, likely dropped from a tree much like Margaret's destroyed oak, lay on the ground, a promise of future growth. The fallout from the municipal hearing spread through Oak Ridge Estates like a controlled demolition. Diane Brennan's carefully constructed world collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Her husband's landscaping business began hemorrhaging clients. Her brother-in-law faced a municipal investigation. Her nephew's promising career in city planning suddenly looked like a high-wire act without a safety net. Margaret's phone became a command center. Calls from investigative journalists, municipal officials, and concerned neighbors created a constant hum of activity. Elena handled the overflow, her legal expertise acting as a firewall against potential counterattacks. But Diane wasn't finished. 1 week after the hearing, Margaret found a manila envelope taped to her front door. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, Diane's precise, almost mechanical script. Inside, a single typed page, a threat disguised as a legal warning. This isn't over, the letter read. You disrupted more than just an HOA board. There are consequences beyond what you understand. Margaret shared the letter with Elena over their now ritualistic evening wine. She's desperate, Elena observed, swirling her Cabernet. Desperate people make mistakes. The next move came from an unexpected direction. 3 other longtime Oak Ridge Estates residents contacted Margaret. They'd been quietly documenting years of HOA board misconduct, afraid to speak up until now. Sarah Thompson, a retired school principal, had a file documenting financial irregularities dating back a decade. Mark Rodriguez, a local small business owner, had evidence of selective rule enforcement that bordered on harassment. Each story added another layer to the growing narrative of systemic corruption. The local news media picked up the story. What started as a dispute over a single tree had become an investigation into municipal governance, HOA practices, and the hidden power structures of suburban life. Judge Chen's preliminary ruling was devastating. The HOA board would be subject to a full forensic audit. Diane was suspended pending investigation. The landscaping contract with her husband's company was terminated. But Margaret knew this was just the beginning. During a strategy session in her home office, surrounded by documents and half-empty coffee mugs, she realized the larger battle. This wasn't just about one tree. This was about challenging a system that had operated in the shadows for too long. Alina watched her friend, understanding the fire that burned behind Margaret's calculated exterior. "You're going to keep pushing, aren't you?" Margaret's response was a smile that could cut glass. "Someone has to." Outside, the small sapling where the old oak once stood continued to grow, resilient, unbroken. A living metaphor for everything Margaret represented. The neighborhood would never be the same. The transformation of Oak Ridge Estates happened slowly, then all at once. Margaret's legal crusade had become more than a personal vendetta, it was a neighborhood revolution. New HOA board elections drew record turnout. Residents who had once cowered behind manicured hedges now attended meetings with the intensity of political activists. The old guard, those who had benefited from Diane's regime of silent intimidation, found themselves pushed to the margins. Thomas Reynolds, the retired civil engineer who had been the first to publicly support Margaret, became the new board president. His first act was to implement complete transparency. Every document, every financial record, every decision would be publicly accessible. Diane Brennan had retreated from public view. Her once pristine reputation was now a shattered mirror, reflecting the systematic corruption she had helped maintain. Her husband's landscaping business closed. Her network of influence crumbled like a sandcastle against an incoming tide. Margaret discovered the depth of the rot during the forensic audit. It wasn't just Oak Ridge Estates. Similar patterns of HOA mismanagement existed in neighborhoods across the county. What had started as a personal battle over a single tree had become a catalyst for broader change. Elena watched her friend with a mixture of pride and concern. "You realize you become something of a local hero, right?" Margaret dismissed the notion with a wave of her hand. "Heroes are for fairy tales. This is about accountability." But the neighborhood saw her differently. Children who had once been shushed for playing too loudly now looked at her with a kind of reverence. Elderly residents who had suffered under years of petty HOA rules sent her thank you cards. The local coffee shop created a drink in her honor. The Oak Ridge obstruction, a complex blend that was equal parts bitter and sweet. The legal battles continued. Margaret worked with municipal authorities to draft new guidelines for homeowners associations. Each deposition, each hearing chipped away at the old system of suburban governance. Her grandmother's tree, or rather the memory of it, became a symbol. The small sapling grew, its branches reaching toward the sky with a defiance that mirrored Margaret's own spirit. During one particularly heated community meeting, a young resident approached her. "How did you find the courage to fight back?" he asked. Margaret's response was immediate. It wasn't about courage. It was about what's right. The municipal investigation expanded. Diane's brother-in-law faced potential criminal charges. Her nephew's career in city planning was effectively over. The web of connections that had allowed such systemic abuse began to unravel. But Margaret knew the battle was far from over. This was just one neighborhood, one system, one small victory in a much larger war against bureaucratic overreach. As sunset painted the Oak Ridge Estates in golden light, the sapling stood as a testament to resilience, to hope, to the power of one person willing to stand up and say, "Enough."